The man who would become Rhodesia's most infamous white traitor arrived not as a soldier or a politician but as a preacher. Garfield Todd emigrated to southern Rhodesia from New Zealand in 1934 as a Protestant missionary and ran the Rhodesian New Zealand Churches of Christ Mission School. He was 26 years old, fresh from theological college, and brimming with the kind of confident moral certainty that tends to either make great men or catastrophically dangerous ones. In Todd's case, it would eventually produce both. As superintendent of the Rhodesian mission in the Shabani district, he developed a lifelong commitment to the colony's African majority, which he expressed through a political career spanning 5 decades. The mission was not merely a chapel in the bush. Todd built it into an institution, expanding classrooms, training teachers, running a clinic with his wife, Grace, where, despite having no formal medical qualifications, he delivered hundreds of babies and treated minor injuries. He was energetic, charismatic, and possessed of the settler's deep physical confidence in the African landscape he had adopted as his own. One of the young men who passed through his care was a quiet, studious teacher named Robert Mugabe. The relationship between mentor and protege would define the arc of both their lives, though not in the ways either man might have predicted. Having built up the educational establishment at Rhodesia through which generations of Zimbabweans were to pass, Todd was in 1946 elected by white miners and ranchers as MP for Shabani. It was an unlikely constituency for a man of his sympathies, but Todd possessed a particular talent for persuading conservative white voters that he was one of them, a farmer, a property owner, a man of practical common sense, while simultaneously holding views that would have appalled them had they been fully understood. Todd quickly climbed the political ladder, and when Huggins became Prime Minister of the newly formed Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland in 1953, Todd took his place as Southern Rhodesian Prime Minister. Once in power, the reformist impulse he had suppressed for electoral reasons broke the surface with startling speed. Todd introduced modest reforms aimed at improving the education of the black majority by redirecting tax money paid by Rhodesian property owners toward black schools. His government introduced a plan to give elementary education to every African of school age. He doubled the number of primary schools and gave grants to missionary-run schools to introduce secondary school and pre-university courses for blacks. He ended the practice of addressing black Rhodesians as African males, insisting they be called Mr. He pushed through legislation allowing multiracial trade unions, a measure specifically designed to undercut white nationalist control of the labor movement. He moved against the color bar in ways no Rhodesian leader before him had dared. The white establishment watched all this with mounting fury and alarm. He was widely condemned as a dangerous liberal and ousted from power in 1958, deposed not by the electorate but by his own cabinet. Returning from a holiday in Cape Town in January 1958, he was met by a delegation of ministers who submitted their resignations. The final straw, reportedly, was being made to watch Todd's home movies of Ghana's independence celebrations, footage of joyful black Africans taking the reins of a state that, in the minds of the white Rhodesian establishment, demonstrated the precise catastrophe they were determined to prevent. Todd's enthusiasm for those images told them everything they needed to know about where his loyalties ultimately lay. Thousands of Africans wept and sang songs in his praise. An editorial in the African Daily News said that Garfield Todd was the one white politician that blacks admired and trusted, and that his fall was a severe blow to the forces of moderate reform. He had been the last, best chance for a peaceful negotiated settlement, or so his admirers claimed. His enemies would have described him differently, as a man who had used the machinery of white governance to systematically undermine it from within. What happened next confirmed their worst fears. Out of power and increasingly unmoored from the white political world that had cast him aside, Todd moved in the opposite direction with the single-mindedness of a convert. While committed to widening the franchise and measures to improve opportunities for Africans in education and at the workplace, Todd at first obeyed Huggins's golden rule: be as liberal as you like, but don't shout about it. That restraint was now gone entirely. Following his outspoken opposition to Rhodesia's unilateral declaration of independence on November 11, 1965, Garfield Todd was subjected to restriction orders by Ian Smith's government, confining him primarily to the Rhodesian mission ranch and prohibiting public political engagement or travel. The restriction was meant to silence him. Instead, it radicalized him further. Confined to his ranch under house arrest, Todd did not spend those years in passive reflection. While Ian Smith's government believed it had neutralized one of its most irritating opponents by binding him to several thousand acres of bushveld in Matabeleland, They had in fact handed him the ideal cover for something far more dangerous than speeches or press interviews. Todd himself would later admit in an interview with the Toronto Globe and Mail, "Of course, we were cooperating with the guerrillas. I'd have 20 of them sitting with their arms and their ammunition and their rocket launchers on the front stoop in the middle of the night. Very dangerous." The candor was almost casual, as though harboring armed insurgents on your veranda at 3 in the morning was a perfectly ordinary extension of pastoral duty. He elaborated further, "Confined here as I was, under house arrest for 4.5 years, I saw a lot of action. I was never actually involved in any violent act, but we felt there was no option but to support the nationalist cause." Unknown to the Smith regime, he gave help to black guerrillas trying to overthrow the white government. The ranch, Hoko Nui, sat in exactly the right geography: remote, difficult to monitor, close enough to the operational areas where Zipra and Zanlakadas were moving through the country. Whatever the precise nature of that help, shelter, food, intelligence, passage, it was rendered to men who were killing white farmers, white soldiers, and black Rhodesians they deemed collaborators with equal impartiality. His daughter Judith was cut from the same cloth and operated in a wider arena. In 1972, Todd and his daughter, Judith, were imprisoned for a second time. From 1972 to June 1976, Todd was restricted to his ranch. It was then that a civil war erupted with about 30,000 guerrillas fighting against a similar number of government forces. The Rhodesian Bush War was grinding toward its inevitable conclusion, measured in farmhouse ambushes, landmines on dirt roads, contact firefights in the Mopane, and the slow economic asphyxiation of a country the world had collectively decided must not be allowed to survive in its existing form. Todd had contributed materially to that project of asphyxiation. His comments generally used religion as a kind of shield. Todd worked closely with the World Council of Churches, and, in September 1970, the organization announced their first grants of $7,000 each to ZAPU and ZANU. The money, they said, was for social welfare programs such as childcare and help for mothers. The notion that ZAPU and ZANU, organizations then actively conducting an armed insurgency against the Rhodesian state, would route foreign funds exclusively to childcare required a degree of credulity that strained the imagination. Garfield knew this full well and justified it, commenting to the Sunday Mail, "No Christian wishes to see force used, but a growing number of members of world churches held that the violence being done to the spirit of the black man in South Africa and Rhodesia is intolerable and that it must be resisted." It was a formulation he had refined over the years: frame everything as spiritual necessity, let the implications remain unstated, ensure plausible deniability while directing material and political support toward men with rocket launchers. Whether one views this as moral courage or cynical maneuvering depends entirely on which side of the Rhodesian question one occupies, and that question has never been fully settled. One of Rhodesia's most prolific assassins, Ian Taffy Bryce, was at the airport in Gaborone, Botswana, when he spotted Todd in the waiting lounge. Both men were heading for Lusaka, the Zambian capital, Todd, clearly, to go and meet with ZAPU officials. The Rhodesian security services had been tracking his movements for years, and it was not only Taffy who had considered the merits of simply solving the Todd problem in the manner they solved most problems in those years. Todd survived the war intact. Many of the men he opposed did not. When Ian Smith finally ran out of road, and Zimbabwe was born in April 1980, Garfield Todd's reward was swift. Lord Soames, following the recommendation of Prime Minister-elect Robert Mugabe, appointed Todd to the Senate on the 8th of April, 1980, where Todd served until his retirement in 1985. The man his own government had twice imprisoned, the man who had sat armed guerrillas on his veranda and lobbied the world's churches to fund a nationalist insurgency, was now a senator in the state whose creation he had worked for across 3 decades. He donated 3,000 acres of good arable land to a cooperative of unemployed and disabled ex-terrorists. In time, it would house 480 of them. He was, in the eyes of black Zimbabwe, something approaching a hero. One prominent ZANU-PF historian later called him the white African Moses who delivered the black Zimbabweans out of bondage. Todd's disillusionment began when Mugabe's North Korean-trained 5th Brigade swept through Matabeleland and slaughtered some 30,000 dissident Endebel speakers. The man he had sheltered in his mission school, whose political cause he had championed at the cost of his freedom and his standing among his own people, was now conducting massacres in the very region where Todd had built his life. The senator who had helped legitimize the new Zimbabwe found himself watching the country consume itself. Todd became disillusioned with the new regime. "I am horrified by the destruction of our economy, the starving of our people, the undermining of our constitution, the torture and humiliation of our nation by ZANU, PF, said Todd, who promised to defy the man he had once so admired. Mugabe's response was predictable and petty. In 2002, he was stripped of Zimbabwean nationality. The man who had betrayed his own government was now betrayed in turn by the government he had helped bring to power. Garfield Todd died on the 13th of October, 2002, at the age of 94, on the same ranch where he had once harbored men with rocket launchers in the dark. He was appointed a Knight Bachelor for services to Africa and New Zealand by Queen Elizabeth II in the 1986 New Year Honours, at the instigation of the New Zealand government. His legacy remains one of the most genuinely contested in Southern African history.